Devastating rivals. It's hard to count the number of shonen anime that use the trope of the pure-hearted protagonist and their abrasive rival. And in modern anime, one of the clearest examples of the stock shonen rival character is My Hero Academia's Katsuki Bakugo. A fan-favorite character whose unpleasant personality doesn't win many hearts in canon, Bakugo primarily acts as protagonist Izuku Midoriya's rival and character foil. But is that all there really is to him? I don't think so. It's pretty hard to boil a character as layered as Bakugo down to an example of a classic trope. But what else is there? How does he both fulfill and subvert the shonen rival trope? To answer these questions, we're going to have to define that term first. So what do I mean when I keep talking about the trope? A stock shonen rival by definition is an opponent of the protagonist, often their teammate, whose personality is much more jaded than that of the bright-eyed hero. These characters usually start off stronger than the protagonist, feel threatened by their increasing power, and act as foils to the hero's optimism. Thus, the hero's growth serves to motivate them, as they want to stay a few steps ahead. There are other stock traits that rival characters often have, but those are the ones that are most universal. And that definitely sounds like Bakugo to me. What's interesting about that though, is that Bakugo didn't initially meet most of that criteria. Though Horikoshi stated that he was always meant to be a natural born genius, something most shonen rival characters are, that's about as close as his initial design ever got to fitting that archetype. Though we all know him as an aggressive, brash, and often unpleasant character, he was actually originally meant to be a much kinder and more reliable character. If that had been the Bakugo we met, I suspect he might have served as more of a friendly competitor to Midoriya instead of a true rival, similarly to Todoroki. But since Horikoshi decided that he would be too boring and made him a much less pleasant person to be around, I think I can safely say he checks those boxes. And while we're at it, we have a few boxes for you to check off on. Make sure that you are subscribed to Plot Armor with notifications on to never miss an upload. And Detroit, smash that like button to show us a little love. That being said, referring to Bakugo as a rival character would imply that his arc revolves around that of whomever he is acting as a rival to. And that would obviously be Deku. Given their early history, there is some truth to that. Bakugo and Deku grew up in the same neighborhood and were childhood friends until Bakugo's quirk manifested, after which he began to let the praise he was getting for his incredible quirk go to his head. Deku, who was quirkless, became a frequent target of his bullying as Bakugo believed himself to be above him. Deku's constant attempts to remain friends and help Bakugo when possible only fanned the flames of that mistreatment though, making Bakugo feel insecure and driving him to lean heavily into the idea of his own superiority. In that sense, Bakugo is a classic rival. Even though he was the one who started off with all the advantages, he still feels extremely threatened by Deku. One incident from their childhood, when Deku tried to help him up after he fell into a creek, has been a particularly persistent reminder of that. For years, it fueled Bakugo's determination to maintain a superior status, always looking down on his rival. And Horikoshi even describes his personality as that of an abusive egotist. That checks the personality contrast box for sure. Bakugo seems like a pretty standard rival character whose antagonistic history with the protagonist drives him to strive for the top, a path that Deku's growth often muddies. He is antagonistic towards others, naturally gifted, and determined to win at all costs, especially over Deku. But is that really all Bakugo's role in the story amounts to? It might have been once, but I don't think that's the case anymore. I'd even argue that Bakugo has outgrown that archetype somewhat over time, functioning in the story as less of a rival and more of an inspiration and foil. Taking the lead, growth and development. Granted, this isn't an entirely new development. As far back as the provisional license exam arc, long before Bakugo had reached the level of maturity he has now, we see Aizawa acknowledge that his drive and passion are inspiring to his classmates. But even back then, it is an interesting dichotomy. In spite of his poor treatment of most of his classmates, who derisively refers to them as extras, a lot of them look to him as a source of inspiration, motivating them to push for the top. And though it doesn't win him many fans, his personality does make him a natural leader, one whom people prove to be surprisingly willing to follow. We see that in the joint training arc when his classmates trust his instincts enough to go along with his plan, even though he didn't ask for the input about it or even really run it by them beforehand. This says a lot about his role in his class and in the story that people will do what he asked them to do even when they object to how he asked. And that trust illustrates something else that we see in the joint training arc. The beginnings of Bakugo's growth from an egotistical soloist to, well, somewhat of a team player. His strategy in this 4-on-4 fight with Class B revolves around coming out of the battle with every single member of his team unscathed, a goal he accomplishes. That win by saving approach is a step forward. It's pretty clear from the outset that Bakugo's initial approach to heroics is a simple, win at all costs mindset, focused more on his own glory than anything else. He wants to win, he wants to keep Deku from usurping him, and, probably more than anything, he wants to continue to feel superior to others. So the joint training arc is a pretty big turning point for him. It's when we see him truly start to value others. using his talents and instincts to lead instead of running off on his own. And that is sort of the culmination of what he has learned in his time at UA up to that point, and though his delivery still needs some serious work, is definitely more team player than rival. So already, by about the halfway point of what we have so far, we are starting to see Bakugo's role change. Not only is he far less rash when it comes to acting on his personal grudges, but others take notice of and are inspired by Bakugo's growth. He is definitely no longer so obsessive about his rivalry as to pick a fight with Deku as an outlet for his feelings of guilt and inferiority. He might still be trying to surpass him, but there is more to him than just that rivalry. He has even become willing to cooperate with Deku, helping him to train with Black Whip and acknowledging, to some extent, that his childhood bullying was a result of his false feelings of superiority. It's pretty clear at that point, which comes during the Pivotal War arc, that Bakugo is a lot more than a rival. Not only is his relationship with Deku in the slow process of being mended, but he is starting to develop as a character in his own right, outside of simply powering up to better keep up with the person he wants to surpass. He's willing to cooperate and is much more self-aware, even if he's still not going to win any awards for best behavior. And I mean, we can't forget the fact that during the war arc, he took a potentially fatal hit to protect someone he spent most of his life bullying. If that isn't evidence of growth, I really don't know what is. Since that point, Bakugo's recent development has been a lot more of the same. He is at the helm of the plan to retrieve Deku when he goes off on his own, showing both his concern for his rival and his status as a leader among his classmates. He is actually the one to locate Deku and inform the class of his whereabouts, which I think really cements the central place they have in each other's arcs. Fittingly, Bakugo is very involved in the class's efforts to bring Deku back to UA. Of all the students' efforts to convince him to do so, it is his acknowledgement of his past wrongdoings that comes the closest to getting through to him. The fact that many of the most important emotional beats in this battle are related to the relationship between Bakugo and Deku says a lot about Bakugo's role in the narrative. There is a reason that in the face of Deku's resistance, it is his longtime rival whose words hit the most. So why do we care? Okay, so that's all great, we get it, this guy has grown a lot since his Gremlin days. But what's the big deal? Other than the obvious redemption of a fan favorite character, why does the story care about Bakugo's growth? Well, I think that comes back to the point I just made about the reversal in the pattern of who saves who between Deku and Bakugo. When we meet the two of them, it very quickly becomes apparent that Bakugo's hostility arose from a reoccurring pattern. Even when he was quirkless, Deku was always trying to swoop in and save Bakugo. That made Bakugo feel threatened, fueling his inferiority complex and the superiority complex that he tried to use to cover it up, and led to the fissure in their relationship that they are still trying to mend. In a certain way then, Bakugo was actually the very first person to truly believe in Deku. Why else would he have felt so threatened by him? And when you get into that, you also have to get into the reversal of that pattern later on. Nowadays, it's almost always Bakugo coming to Deku's aid, and I think that is the pattern that he has intended to take from the start, one of reversal. No, he will never be especially similar to his friendly, optimistic, and nerdy rival, but Bakugo is developing qualities of leadership, empathy, and self-reflection that have mostly been afforded to Deku alone. And those things allow him to step into the saving role that Deku used to hold in their relationship. Ironically, even though his stated goal is to surpass Deku, I actually think that the more he comes into his own, the more he resembles him. That's why I say you can't really talk about Bakugo without bringing up Deku. As much as he is his own character, his motivations have always been tied to Deku. And it's hard to understand anything he does or his role in the story without acknowledging that fact. I think it is safe to say that they are simultaneously rivals, close friends, and foils at this point, with Shigaraki even referring to Bakugo as Midoriya's best friend. At this point, you might be asking, what's a foil? To answer that, a character foil is a literary device in which the qualities of one character accentuate opposite qualities in another. And I think the best example I can give of Bakugo and Deku being foils is their childhood admiration of All Might. As children, both Deku and Bakugo want to be heroes like All Might one day. But even though it seems like they both have the same motivation, when we get into the reasons why each admires All Might so much, it starts to become clear that they are actually not coming from the same place at all. Bakugo as a child admires All Might because he always wins, a probable source of his obsession with victory. In essence, what he wants to emulate is All Might's strength and refusal to lose. A younger Deku instead admires the way that All Might is able to save people. Bakugo's desire to be victorious like All Might, while Midoriya wants to save people, are in direct contrast despite manifesting in the same way. Both of them want to become the #1 hero. That's what I mean when I call them foils. The example of their early inspirations illustrates how they bring out each other's strongest ending qualities: Deku's selflessness and Bakugo's desire to win by having directly contrasting qualities. Deku's kind disposition and Bakugo's bluntness make for another pair of foil traits, so do Bakugo's natural talent and Deku's quirklessness. See what I mean? These two are created with differing traits that make them contrast very easily. There is a popular headcanon that when an older Deku takes up All Might's mantle as the symbol of peace, Bakugo might become the symbol of victory. And I think that is a pretty good illustration of what I'm talking about. If that ended up being true, that would make them rivals and allies who have similar goals but opposite approaches. It's a little cheesy, but I really think that idea has a way of demonstrating how they are similar even as they act as each other's foils. Because of that, a big part of Bakugo's story is to accentuate Deku's and vice versa. It's kind of thorny to go there because I don't want to imply that he's not his own character, because he is, but in the end his actions and growth are overwhelmingly influenced by Deku. You kinda can't separate their arcs without undermining the whole point of Bakugo's role in the story thus far. What's fascinating about where he is now in the manga is that he is focusing entirely on the success of his team rather than his own. He has gone from an egotist whose core belief is in the superiority of his own quirk above all others to a much more grounded hero trainee who is able to recognize that nearly everyone around him is as incredible as he is. No longer convinced that he has to stand alone at the top to be worth anything, Bakugo is, if not exactly humble, able to admit that he is no longer the absolute best of the best. It's hard to understand how huge that is for a character who used to be so obsessed with his own superiority, and that, I think, takes his character in an interesting new direction going into the future. However, there is a lot more to Bakugo's growth than just that, since his skill improves greatly as well as his mindset. Though he has always been proficient with his quirk, he has been gradually improving his skills, possessing a greater variety of ultimate moves, the power and resilience to mount large-scale attacks, and the finesse to control the magnitude of his explosions if he doesn't want to harm his target. To gain these new skills, he is trained diligently, even going as far as to stick his hands in boiling water to expand his sweat glands. Since the magnitude of his explosions relies heavily on how much sweat he can store up, this exercise was probably meant to let his body accommodate more sweat, and that in turn has increased both the speed at which he can propel himself using his quirk and the damage his explosions can do. Bakugo's quirk has always been a source of both pride and a stumbling block. But even so, he has neither rested on his laurels nor let it impede his progress, and he has remained committed to improving the scope of what he can do with it. What's next? One of the shonen rival hallmarks that I didn't mention earlier is that the protagonist's optimistic, selfless ideals usually defeat the rival's cynicism in the end. We have seen a lot of that already, as like I said, Bakugo learns from Deku. But might it also have something to say about how his arc is going to end? I actually have a feeling that it might. As of the most recent chapters of the manga, Bakugo is with the group that is confronting Shigaraki in Yue's flying fortress. Faced with what honestly looks like certain death for at least a few of them, he has finally learned the importance of teamwork on the deepest possible level, acknowledging how his actions have to be oriented towards helping the collective. That is already one huge example of Deku's team player personality rubbing off on his rival. But where else is that going to lead? Well, we sort of have to acknowledge the possibility that that newfound willingness to cooperate might lead him to sacrifice himself in order to clear a path for his fellow heroes, to quote the words he used in chapter 358. I mean, given who they're up against, it's entirely possible. But I don't see that being the case because narratively, I just don't think it would be a fitting conclusion to his arc. Maybe such an ending would be used to illustrate that an initially self-serving character had become more selfless, or to motivate Deku to muster the colossal effort it would take to beat Shigaraki, but if not, I can't think of any reason why it would make sense to kill off the deuteragonist of the series. There just isn't any obvious reason why death would be a suitable end to his arc. So then what? Well, even if it's not his life, I don't think Bakugo is going to get out of this one without sacrificing something. And that would still be an example of the ever self-sacrificial Deku winning their clash of ideologies. Formidable as Bakugo may be, it's shonen. And the one who believes in the power of friendship and self-sacrifice is pretty much always going to be shown to be right at the end. But it also would probably ring hollow with a lot of readers if Bakugo were to be taken out of commission entirely. That's why I think he's probably going to have a rinse and repeat of his war arc experiences here at the end. He'll risk his life to protect somebody, or just point blank win the fight and suffers a serious injury. But in the end, he makes a full recovery and goes on to continue to contend with Deku for the #1 hero spot. Of course, it's assuming that the hero rankings are even still a thing anymore by the end of the series, which is another can of worms that I'm not going to open up here. On the other hand, I'm kind of torn between thinking that makes sense and wondering if it would feel like cheating if he escaped 2 brushes with death in similar ways. But on the other hand, I feel like the ending of My Hero Academia would feel a little hollow if both his protagonist and his rival didn't live to see the final chapter. After all, they sort of never existed independently of one another in the story. They're closely tied to each other, quite literally from the first chapter. But honestly, I could be wrong. And that's what's so fun about Bakugo's role in this story. Because it subverts some rival tropes while fulfilling others, it's hard to know what is coming next. But in the comments, let us know what you think the future of Bakugo is going to look like. As always, I'm Slice of Otaku. Thank you all so much for watching and have an awesome day. I love you.